Welcome to this episode of Phrasally, Verbocious. We are very excited today to have our first guest interview. Actually, we have some more guests coming up, but we'll announce those in due course. Alan, you did this interview. Who is our guest? And can you tell our listeners a little bit about who he is?
So today, well, it was yesterday, Arthur McKeown and myself were sitting in the Belfast Unemployed Resource Centre, or BERC. And since Arthur is now newly crowned IATEFL ESOL Champion of the Universe, not the official title, we decided to have a little interview while we were at it. So Arthur is officially a retired English teacher. Nobody's told him yet he's retired. He retired in 2015 and set up the Belfast programme, which is an English teaching programme for pre-ESOL students in Ireland. And he set that up in the Belfast Unemployed Resource Centre, which is an organisation for trade unions and social centre in Belfast. So it's a charity organisation to help the unemployed and people suffering from social or economic disadvantages, gets them into training and hopefully gets them into better jobs. So it was an interesting interview, short and sweet, but we hope you enjoy it. So I'm in Belfast Unemployed Resource Centre, or BERC, with our newly crowned ESOL SIG Champion of the Universe, from IATEFL, etc., Arthur McKeown. So Arthur, we've been working together for 5 years? Could you give a bit of background on yourself?
Alan, hello. I'm very old, but I got into English language teaching in 1975 whenever I heard from a fella who was at university with me about how he was starting a career in English language teaching in Sweden, and I applied for and went to Sweden. I was there for a couple of years, involved in teaching mainly pharmacists, and then I was in Kuwait for 3 years, but most importantly, for what I'm doing now, I was in Libya for 4 years as a teacher trainer, centre manager on 3 different continents. That was for a total of 15 years, but then came back to Northern Ireland and had to reinvent myself in 1990, and was out of English language teaching until recently, when I retired. I started to get more involved, especially with the newly arrived Syrians and similar communities who've come to build new lives for themselves here in Northern Ireland.
So since 2015, you met the infamous Suleiman Abdullahi, who told you, now you're retired, you can do a bit of work. What sort of happened then? Tell us a bit about the newly born Belfast programme then.
Well, one of the last jobs I was doing when I was working at the University of Ulster was helping English for employability for people in the town of Cavan, who were primarily from Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, all very qualified people, but they needed help with the job hunting process. And I was talking to some people who were management students in Belfast about this, and they said, well, if you're doing it in Cavan, why are you not doing it in Belfast? So I, with their help, met the Belfast Unemployed Resource Centre, and on a Thursday night we had a job club for people who are already pretty good at English, but they needed to understand the job hunting process and how jobs were advertised in this community, and then the paperwork of a CV, an application form or a covering letter, and then the fun and games that any language teacher can have out of the 50 questions you might be asked at an interview. And that took off, and myself and a few other volunteers, we were well able to deliver it. But then my wife said one day, well, that's Thursday night, sort of, what are you going to do the rest of the time? And I went on to the Horn of Africa People's Aid Northern Ireland, that Hapani website, and a day or two later met Suleiman, who told me about a particular need among the women from the Somali community, and it was for an absolute beginner program to help them take their first steps in English so that they could apply for more formal English classes at the local college. He arranged it, and we took off in the Belfast Islamic Centre, and that ran for over a year and was successful. It was all based on work that had been developed in Tripoli in Libya, where I was the director of a school that provided help for absolute beginners to progress to a mainstream course book. And what had happened in the Islamic Centre for the Horn of Africa women provided a very good testing ground for making sure that the material was appropriate when the VPRS, the Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme, groups of Syrians started to arrive in Belfast. And that's what we've been focusing on over the last few years.
Happani was an interesting thing, especially when I had started English teaching, because that's when we realised a lot of the material really wasn't appropriate. A lot of the mainstream private academy material really wasn't appropriate, so we sort of rewrote in Google Docs like our own sort of material. It was a trial by fire for me because I was using certain books and I was realising that certain students refused to do certain activities even at A1 level.
A lot of the material that has been made available as beginner material is culturally insensitive for many of our learners, but also the gradient is too steep, so we needed to granularise it, break it down into more digestible activities for different lessons, and to some extent localise it to things that they would see in and around Belfast, and personalise it to the interests and needs and indeed aspirations of the learners as we got to know them.
I think one of the things we use quite heavily, certain local supermarkets made a fortune off us, as some of the teaching material was lifted out of the Belfast Welcome Centre or Lidl's front foyer, that kind of thing as well.
Well, certainly none of the learners we encounter have £26 sterling to pay for a beginner course book, so we needed to be really quite creative and entrepreneurial in making use of the ambient English that they were likely to find out in the supermarkets where they went shopping or whatever. And indeed, putting it bluntly, the little catalogue becomes, almost like a dictionary where they can see vocabulary that is of interest to them and, develop some of their numeracy and budgeting skills as well as English vocabulary and other knowledge of the language.
2016 came around then with the Syrian refugee crisis, which was when David Cameron's 2,000 Syrians were to come to Northern Ireland then, and we were sort of the first contact for English classes for most of them. A lot of those classes became the sort of basis for what we learned in Happani, then went into what the Syrians got, which then became sort of almost a finished product, as it were, for teaching English.
Well, we've certainly realised that there's a huge amount of need for English in not just the Syrian but similar communities where people have come to Belfast and beyond. But we do need to provide not only the material and delivery in a way that is appropriate to their needs as adults and adult learners, but also something that can help them to acquire the learning skills that they'll need when they progress to a more formal programme in a college environment. The other thing that has to be said, of course, is that almost perhaps uniquely, we're able to make considerable use of delivery teams with ending up to half a dozen volunteers contributing in different ways to a 2-hour session. And this has provided a way where, while it's led by someone who is qualified and experienced as an English language teacher, others who are perhaps wanting to find out more about English language teaching as a career option for themselves, can get into a community of practice where they can hear about different pre-service training that's available, and sometimes warts and all, the pluses and minuses of working in different countries around the world before they make something in the way of a pretty serious and indeed life-changing decision for themselves.
I think Burke and the Belfast programme went a long way from, you mentioned, not just the students, but also the teachers or possible teachers. So everybody here is a volunteer, but everybody comes from different backgrounds. So for me, even though I taught computer science, I'd never really taught English until we were doing it barefoot in the Islamic Centre. There's a lot of people who have now come through, and it's mainly throughput as well from the younger generations of people who've then gone on to do a lot of different things in a lot of different countries. And then there's also retirees as well. Yeah.
Well, we depend totally on a lot of the goodwill and energy of different volunteers. As you say, some are maybe recently retired or nearing retirement, and they've got 40 years of life skills, qualifications, experience, knowledge. They're a bit different from maybe the 22-year-old who's still finishing off a first degree at university and looking to get into English language teaching, but they bring youthful vitality, which is a very different perception from what I myself might be contributing.
Talking about the sort of English teaching industry then, what's the differences been from when you started in the 70s to, is it just technology has kicked in, or have you noticed other things since your time in the industry?
At least three things. One is there's much greater awareness of what English language teaching is among so many parts of the community and indeed the local economy. Certainly technology has had a big impact, and while people still value books and so on, there are things that you couldn't have dreamt about in terms of what used to be done in language laboratories and so on. The other big thing though is that Northern Ireland is still wide open to further development as a place to provide English language teaching with private language schools. We've only got a few so far in Northern Ireland, and there must be very considerable potential for more.
And since we get a lot of new teachers that come through here, what would your sort of CPD or career development advice be for them then?
Just look at a local community area, the place around where you live, and see if there's an opportunity to observe and contribute to either a church or a voluntary group where you can see some of the learners who come along, but then getting more involved in a bit of training that will help you make a better informed decision about does it suit you to do something like the CELTA, which is the industry standard, recognised right around the world. 10,500 people do it successfully every year, but it's available as a 4-week course, which suits some people, but it's also available part-time, or it's available online. So look at different ways of delivery that are being provided for the CELTA. Also, there are reputable Level 5 courses available from other suppliers like the TEFL Academy, and that might suit individuals in their personal circumstances a bit better than something that's so intense as the 4-week course.
And last one then, what's your prediction for the future of English language teaching then? Are we all going to be on computers in 5 years' time, or is it going to be pen and paper, just like I like it?
I think over the next 5 years, and it's a good timescale for this, there will be huge changes with AI and artificial intelligence that will maybe have an impact on how people communicate. But that said, I think there's still going to be, and will continue to be for a long time, a need for people who can with a fair amount of sincerity and genuineness, provide the communication skills that their learners will benefit from. You can do a certain amount from the technology, but it's all about face-to-face human interaction, perhaps mediated in some cases through the technology, but even things that we can't even dream may be in place in as short as 5 years from now.
Nice one. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Phrasally Verbocious. If you'd like to get in touch, you can tweet us
At PhrasallyV on Twitter.
You can email us
PhrasallyVerbocious@gmail.com.
You can check out our show notes online at
PhrasallyVerbociouspodcast.blogspot.com.
And please like, review and comment us on your podcast subscription service of choice. Goodbye.
Goodbye.